Yeah, can I bring this comment about the economy and from the viewpoint of an economist to the educational setting and speaking as an educator here. And I like what you said about the economy and how people transform themselves through economic institutions that could be more democratic or less democratic. And the same thing happens with educational institutions. Leonardo Britzer, the Brazilian sociologist, talks about the paradox of democracy in the sense that during the 20th century, many educational thinkers and political scientists thought that with increasing levels of education, we were going to have a better quality of democracy, and we're going to have more democratic, more solidarious, more caring, better citizens in a way. And history shows us that the educational levels of the population has increased to levels unprecedented in history of humanity, and still the quality of our democracies and our characteristics as human beings are not entirely democratic, they are not caring, they are not necessarily solidarious, etc., etc. So there are different hypotheses on why we have this democratic deficit, if you want to call it today. And two hypotheses that have been raised have to do with the nature of education that we have is not only the increasing levels of education, but also what type of education we have. And the second explanation is the interrupted democracy that we have, that consists in mainly going to the ballot box in most countries every 4 years. So in terms of the education that we receive is exactly what Robin was talking about some economic system, that they are authoritarian, they're top-down, so we don't develop our capacity to become democratic, caring, tolerant, etc., necessarily through an educational system that relies on a banking education model that deposits knowledge in the minds of the students, and is authoritarian, etc. And in terms of the interrupted democracy, the problem is how can we become more democratic citizens is all we are asked for in terms of democracy is just casting a vote every 4 years and then delegating all our political energies and responsibilities to other people. So in that sense, we need to reformulate our educational system to make it more democratic, both in content, in terms of methods, and also in terms of the institutional arrangements of education institutions. And on the other hand, we need to promote more experiments of participatory democracy in different sectors of society, in the workplace, in the schools, everywhere.
This, you raised the 2 points, and one was, relates to the whole question of effectively representative democracy versus a direct democracy, and the other question relates to the particular characteristics of education. And in fact, that's where I was going to pose that question, because what you were describing is the kind of critique made by Paulo Freire of a particular authoritarian form of education which prevents people from growing, or if it doesn't prevent them from growing, doesn't allow them to grow into fuller people. It warps them, it cripples them in many ways. And I was curious as to how much that influenced you in your work, but also whether you Robin got into any learning theory in some of your thinking about the question of human beings transforming themselves.
Well, despite the fact that I make my living as a professor, which means I am in the education industry. And one of the great failings, of course, is higher education, is that none of us are rewarded for or spend much time thinking about actual pedagogy. That's not what happens at universities. So we're the last ones to actually think about the education system, even though there we are at the top of the education system. You'd think these people would think a little bit about it. Well, we tend not to. One of my favorite essays by a fellow economist is by Sam Bowles, published in Challenge magazine back in 1991. It was a great title, What Markets Can and Cannot Do. And there's a passage in there where he says, markets are, amongst other things, besides being allocative mechanisms, as economists would think of them, besides, distributing the burdens and benefits of economic activity more or less fairly, and however efficient or inefficient they may be, markets are also giant schools. They are schools, and we economists don't think about them as schools, and we don't evaluate them as schools in terms of what they teach people to do and what they do not teach people to do. In particular, in that essay, he was remarking that private employment or sort of the centrally planned workplace in the old Soviet economies certainly was not a school that taught people how to make decisions about what they wanted to do themselves. I mean, it did just the opposite. So markets do not teach us to empathize with other people. They don't teach us the kind of sort of democratic skills of interaction that would be important if we think democracy is important. The other thing that has come up, in work that I've done about, designing, alternative economic sort of institutions regarding education is this, that, and then if you put all those people, into workplaces where you still have some people doing all the conceptual work and other people doing all the sort of rote work, over time, the right for one person, one vote in these enterprises is going to become less and less meaningful. And that's an important thing to take into account.
This is something Marx, in describing, capitalist production, stresses the way in which the whole character of capitalist production separated the process of thinking and doing. And he talks about the crippling of human beings in this process, and not only the crippling of human beings, but this complete separation of the mind from the hand. They become hostile to each other. And basically, what you're suggesting is that if you don't transform that, no matter what kind of educational system, you're going to have the reemergence of this, real divisions within society. But that was certainly true in Yugoslavia, where they trained people in the schools. They talked constantly about self-management. Everybody must be engaged in self-management. They went into the workplace, though, and some people weren't trained adequately compared to others, and so they ended up, even though one person, one vote, they ended up rubber stamping proposals from experts. And you didn't have the kind of transformation that was implied by the changes in the educational system, or which was implied by the ideology of self-management. I wanted to come back to the education issue, and because here we're talking about the workplace as a school, effectively, the market as a school, and it gets into a concept of the school is everywhere, and I'm sort of thinking in terms of the idea of education as occurring really in every part of the society. This comes back to your thinking about informal learning, what people are learning in participatory budgeting.
Yeah, when we think about education, we tend to think almost automatically only in schools. And educators distinguish between three subsystems within the educational system. The formal school system, that is a ladder that goes from kindergarten to university. It's sequential, and you need to fulfill the requirements of one degree to go to the next one. Then we have the sector that is called non-formal education, that can be workshops. These are any organized educational activity that is not part of the formal sector. And then we have a large sector of the educational system that's called the informal education system, that is everything else. And it's all the learning that we acquire through watching movies, through participating in conversation, through the market, through all the daily activities that we have in our lives, from birth to our death. And interestingly enough, this is the area in which we probably learn the most throughout our lives, but it's the most under-researched area in education, because it's very difficult to research. So one of the questions is, what is the relationship between the learning that takes place in a particular institution and the characteristics of this institution, how authoritarian and how democratic is the institution. Because what happens usually in the school system is a big discrepancy between the content, the method, and the environment. The content tends to be very progressive, and we talk about democracy, as they talked about self-management in Yugoslavia. Then the method tends to be authoritarian, and the school environment tends to be authoritarian. So you have a gap here between content, method, and environment.
So, but here's the question. Let's assume that there were, some strange or wonderful revolution in education. So there were Freireans, critical pedagogists who took over the educational system and created a different kind of educational system. No more bank knowledge, being delivered to a passive, group at the bottom, but allowing people to grow. But then they go off into a society which is structured to not permit them to grow, which is the workplace, the market, etc., which does not build solidarity, it does not build a sense of being one of a large family, etc. It raises the question, well, how can you change one thing without changing everything?
Well, this came up the other day in the conversation we were having, and my feeling about all this is that participation is infectious. If you increase participation in one sphere of somebody's life and they come to learn it and expect that this is how it's going to be done, and then you put them in an environment where you do not permit this to go on, you're going to have friction. And
it can go either way.
That's right. And things can go either way. If things go well, there'll be a spreading of the infection of participation into the institutions that were authoritarian. If those authoritarian institutions are basically, if they remain in place, then they will have a real dampening effect, on the people that are involved in those institutions. And you'll see,
Daniel's work, I think.
Yeah, I also noted that in my research, what we call the internal effect of participatory democracy and the expansive effect of participatory democracy. In terms of the internal impact of participatory democracy, we have enough evidence that by and large, if the enabling structures for participation are well designed, are democratic, etc., people develop through their practice more democratic attitudes. They become more willing to engage in self-governance. They develop their capacity for self-governance. They become more caring, more tolerant, more solidarious, etc., etc. And the expansive effect is that they start, to apply this new knowledge and skills that they have, these democratic knowledge, skills, attitudes, practice, etc., to other settings, be the family, be in the schools, be any social network, social clubs, etc. And for example, in Puerto Alegre, they started with the participatory budget at the level of the neighborhoods, and a few years later, you have, for example, participatory budgeting in the schools. So it spreads this infectious democratic disease that moves from one institution to another. It's possible.
But it's also possible that the lack of change in one sphere will, in fact, smother where you are making advances. So
it's a tension.
It's a struggle. Yeah. So then the question is, let's say, and I remember you were talking about this, people who were involved in participatory budgeting in Porto Alegre would, especially women, would go back to their families and be more self-assertive, more confident, etc. But that then becomes an individual battle, which they're conducting atomistically. Each family, this is happening. Don't you need a movement, in order to carry through the message, that the lessons being learned in one part of their lives?
And or don't you need it? Isn't it important for the movement for progressive social change to recognize that all these spheres of social life will have to be transformed? That it's not going to be in lockstep. You're not going to make the same amount of progress in every sphere of social life at the same pace. But the entire project will, over a long period of time, the entire project will move forward together or will not move forward together. It's not going to be possible to move this participatory project together, very far in the economy if other major spheres of social life don't move in that direction as well.